Space outside the porthole looked as if someone had turned off the lights in the universe and never came back. Dead stars, black gaps between them, and a silence so heavy it seemed proud of itself. The ship beneath me creaked with metal and nerves, instruments ticking like worn-out hearts, and I stood there realizing this wasn't just an observer's position. It was a line I could never cross back over. I was the commander, yet in that moment my crew felt more like neighbors in shared panic than subordinates. And the strangest thing was how suddenly the urge to crack a small joke just wouldn't come. Laughter, I thought, was too expensive a currency to waste when the survival of humanity was at stake. Memories of Earth came more often than maps on the navigation screen. I saw old streets, the smell of rain on asphalt, the glow of shop windows where you could still buy something warm, and my mother's voice, no longer clear in my mind, but still echoing like survival instructions. Once it all felt permanent, you could return, repair, fix. Now distance was measured not in miles, but in losses. And the deeper we went into the fog zone, the clearer it became that losses could turn into legend, and legend into a word children would never hear. We only knew fragments of the war, scraps of signals and a couple of real nights when the sky burned as if it were trying to explain something to us. Civilization didn't break in one day, but in a single moment the familiar supports vanished. Treaties, currency, laws, even the little courtesies that kept people apart. We didn't just lose a planet, we lost everything that could be packed into the word normal. Out of this shift towards survival's new rules came our flotilla. A cluster of ships with holes in their hulls and people worn down by constant loss counts. The fog zone was our choice when there was no choice. The name sounded like an ad slogan, but in reality it was a region where stars looked like old men tired of shining, and radio signals faded like whispers in your ear. Beacons went silent and reliable routes disappeared, but there was one advantage. Hunters rarely came here, or at least that's what we hoped. We hid in silence, redistributing power between shields and hope, trying to preserve whatever could still be called human. Inside the fleet, there was a sense of living moment to moment. People lived in short days, breaking their worries into hourly shifts, like scattering pebbles along a path no one intended to restart. On the outside, we looked organized, charts, schedules, lists on the walls, but inside it was chaos glued together with small rituals. Someone brewed coffee, someone collected photos, someone played old glitchy video games. These rituals were our medicine, and I remember once finding a mechanic who at night read children's books in the dark, so his hands wouldn't forget gentleness. Anxiety spread quietly, like corrosion, first as a faint ringing in the ears, then as a constant heavy breath in the systems. I learned to recognize it in small signs, in how the senior officer held his gaze longer on the screen, in how engineers laughed louder to drown out the eerie sense that someone had spoken the last word in the room. We set up extra watches, moved sensors around, but deep down we knew. These methods didn't work against anxiety, it demanded other sacrifices. My fear was almost ridiculous. An officer used to giving orders, suddenly realizing he couldn't order time to stop. I caught myself wishing I could buy just one more morning on Earth, just to extend the ticket to the future. And it wasn't just fear for myself, it was fear for those who believed, who waited, who entrusted me with the most precious thing, their everyday lives. Responsibility became heavy, but strangely warm. I felt it like an old coat, maybe out of style, but life-saving in a storm. The sensors once picked up what we feared most: abnormal activity on the far edges, signatures resembling enemy ships, but distorted like reflections in puddles after rain. It wasn't just contact, it felt like we'd been found not by sight, but by memory. At first, the command staff chose silence, not wanting to spark panic. Some suggested a breakthrough, others a scout, some argued for a sharp maneuver. But the truth was we had neither the resources nor any guarantee of success. The war had taught us to value even the smallest chances more than once seemed reasonable. Inside, I argued with myself like a child choosing between ice cream and duty. Duty's voice spoke of the people watching us from the tents of survival, of those holding the last grains of Earth's memory. Practicality whispered that we could run. But would the children escape the emptiness left behind? I realized leadership wasn't just orders on paper, it was carrying other people's fears like a backpack, and choosing a path when all roads looked equally dangerous. We gathered for a meeting where suggestions sounded like bets in a bad game. Risk everything for a breakthrough. Send a limited set of ships on a diversion. Search for a safer zone deeper in the fog. I heard the arguments like fragments of songs, familiar but not mine. Someone said fleeing meant preserving the last flame of hope. Someone else said staying meant proving the worth of a human life. Inside me grew the sense that the decision wasn't to be made by vote, but by the pounding of a heart. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, it felt like space whispered around us. Not a whisper in the usual sense, but more like a quiet commentary on our struggle to hold on. I saw strange shapes in the ionized clouds, flickering like memories of distant bonfires on Earth, and I caught myself thinking awkwardly that maybe space wasn't empty, just forgetful. Laughter at such thoughts would have felt like betrayal, but I smiled inwardly. To keep some balance, like a man cracking a joke while waiting at the doctor's office. Preparing for a choice turned into a mechanical ballet. Notes on resource distribution, lists on the board, regulated procedures that hid the core, nerves. We readied the fleet for retreat, though no one wanted to admit retreat was just a softer word for running. I saw young pilots with eyes full of resolve and old mechanics with hands worn from fixing what was never fully fixable. Each carried their own private legend, and I felt my role wasn't just to give orders, but to weave those legends into one thread. The night before, the decision was short and strangely clear inside the ship. On the bridge, I sat alone, staring at maps that smiled cruelly with their blank zones. I wanted to postpone the choice, as if I could schedule a day of rest, but time ignored tricks like that. I shuffled possible outcomes like cards in a deck, each one a living fate, and finally understood the most honest path was to accept I'd have to sacrifice. The realization didn't come with grandeur. It felt like cutting off a piece of bread to hand to someone else. The decision wasn't a single word, but a chain of small final steps. Redistributing energy reserves, prepping old engines for maximum strain, briefing the crew for evacuation, setting up backup communication lines. I signed an order that looked formal on the surface, but was, at its core, a sentence for myself. I would stay and play the decoy so the others could escape. In that moment, the complex machinery of command turned into something simple, human, a request for trust. I couldn't give a farewell speech. Our rules made words tools for the radio, not the soul. So instead I left actions, skipping over reports, starting auto-programs, setting maneuvers. It felt like arranging chess pieces not against a computer, but against death itself. And the more carefully I did it, the less room there was for panic. Preparing for sacrifice required precision, but had little romance in it. Just tedious, necessary procedures like sealing the last bolts and checking no one had left a coffee cup on the bridge. When the fleets began leaving, I felt the ship grow empty of the people I knew by name and by habit. They walked through the airlocks, carrying only what they deemed worth saving. There was no cinematic drama in their movements. It was quiet, like picking apples before a storm. Some couldn't help but cry silently, others laughed so they wouldn't meet reality's eyes. I remember a nurse leaving an old notebook with children's drawings on the console, as if placing a small piece of home inside the steel. The first clash wasn't anything like a Hollywood show. There were no staged explosions, no choreographed fight scenes. There was chaos, where sounds rose and sank like metal dropped into deep water. I saw the system throw energy into the shields, sparks racing along the conduits, warping the light. People carried out their small acts, heroic or not. Someone held down a button while their legs shook. Someone quietly counted ammunition. In that ugly choreography of lethal machinery, I was the conductor without training. There was a moment when I thought it was over. Warnings flashed red, algorithmic signals screamed in my ears, and I felt that strange calm people get when they know the price of the final step. Bits of memory flickered in my mind. The smell of bread on earth, my child's first steps, silly little things that once felt important. In that instant, I didn't feel regret for the past, but surprise that all of it had truly been my life. And deep inside the fear, I found a tiny laugh. It was as absurd as everything happening, and it kept me from falling apart. My diversion plan wasn't about stealing victory, but about scattering the enemy's focus, making myself visible, predictable, and at the same time dangerous. We lit up signal beacons, mimicked maneuvers, launched decoys, and created the illusion of a massive fleet closing in. It was theatrical, but theater in space was never art. It was a survival tool. It felt like being back on stage, only now in a costume reeking of burnt metal, with no lines to speak. When the enemy turned to us, we became the target not out of bravery, but because we were convenient prey. It was like taking on the hatred of the world just to give the others a chance to run. In those moments, glory never crossed the mind. What mattered were the small things that make people human. Someone holding a friend's hand, someone whispering a farewell prayer in a language long gone from official papers. I saw those gestures and knew they were as vital as any tactical success. The ship's energy drained steadily, shields cracked, and the hull wore its destruction like new scars. People carried out their duties almost automatically. Some adjusted stabilizers, others remapped the controls, some prayed in secret, some hid their photos. I felt a strange closeness to them. We weren't just a crew, we were a small family unit where everyone knew survival demanded personal loss. This everyday heroism had no place on screens, but it was stronger than any propaganda. At the point when nearly everything was lost, I realized my sacrifice wasn't meaningless. On the radar, I saw distant signals fade, heard that other ships were accelerating, and it was like a fragile symphony of rescue, with our notes playing in the background. It felt fragile, like thin ice beneath my feet, but it was real. The tears weren't for show, they ran quietly, mixing with smoke and salt, and they were my reward for not abandoning duty. The final minutes on the bridge were filled with a strange light. Not just from the indicators, but from the inner sense that maybe the world would go on without us. I thought about those who had left and those who remained, and understood this wasn't a story about my death. It was about what was left behind, the people I had helped escape. That thought didn't give me grandeur, but lightness. I stopped fighting the inevitable and became a careful witness. Small details mattered more than ever: the drip of the cooling system, the faint rustle of a cable, the deep breath of the technician beside me. In the last moments, I held the image of Earth like a talisman. Not as nostalgia, but as a tool of understanding. Earth had people who laughed at little things, who grew plants in old pots, who read poetry in waiting lines. Those small things were my proof humanity was worth carrying on. My sacrifice was an attempt to preserve exactly those simple things that give life meaning. I thought if even one of them survived, my mission was complete. When the hull started to split, the sound was so personal, it felt like it spoke only to me. I saw an image of our little flotilla turning into a line of light rushing into the unknown, and in that line was the hum of hope. I understood then that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was admitting fear and stepping into the void because someone else had to keep going. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a simple human truth. Amid explosions and electrical discharges, I allowed myself a small joke. I imagined how one day children on a new planet would argue over whether our fleet really sounded like an orchestra. It was a ridiculous image, but the absurdity gave me strength to endure the pain and carry out the final actions with maximum precision. Laughter sometimes turns out to be the most practical weapon, because it can cut through the tension and create space for action. At the moment when everything felt final, I realized I had left behind not just a tactical plan, but also a story. I tried to ensure that people would not remember me as a hero, but remember what we tried to preserve: the sense of community, habits, jokes, books, photographs. I pictured how these things would take root on new shores, becoming the start of a new culture, where the memory of Earth would live not in archived data, but in children's drawings and whispered phrases. While the ship burned, I let my thoughts wander through time. I remembered how, as a child, I was afraid of the dark, and how my father would turn on a nightlight to show me that the world could be made safer with a simple act. Now I was that nightlight for the people I knew. I couldn't give them a warm bed or a home, but I could give them time and a chance. And for me, that meant more than any medal. Honor, I thought, isn't a glittering cover, but the ability to make a choice, even if it seems meaningless. The last fragments of electricity gave time only for brief memories. Once I read a letter where someone wrote about tiny joys that become immense in hard times. Those joys, the smell of bread, the sound of rain on a roof, someone's laughter, became what was worth fighting for. I pieced those images together in my mind like a puzzle, and in the end they formed one simple element: hope. I understood that even a single spark of hope could ignite into a fire if nurtured. I didn't wait for the complete end to understand the meaning of my actions. The moment the signal stopped, I felt relief, not as release from labor, but as the realization of duty fulfilled. I saw in my mind the faces of those who had left, and I understood that my fate was their chance. To be a father to many people is difficult, but I was lucky to be one in that moment. I wasn't looking for gratitude. It would have been unnecessary. The ship finally stopped being a home and became a monument. This monument was not built of stone, but shaped in the memory of the people I knew. I was certain that true deeds are not loud headlines, but small things. Passing along a map, writing down a bread recipe, recording a melody, telling a joke to lift the mood. These were things that could be more valuable than any chest of gold in new worlds. When I closed my eyes, I wasn't afraid of being forgotten. I knew my image might dissolve into history, but what mattered more was what I left behind. The threads of human experience that others could unravel and weave into a new fabric of life. That feeling made the final pain different, less sharp, more meaningful. Our mission here was not to declare the end, but to sow the beginning. Philosophically, I concluded that courage is like an old tree, its roots sinking into the past, while its branches reach for the future. We, as people, sometimes become those roots when we choose not to save ourselves, but to give others a chance. I didn't want to appear as a model of morality. I was an ordinary person who once took on someone else's hope and carried it forward, as if someone had asked, "Wait, help us get through." In the end, as the ship dissolved, I thought of a comedy I imagined once as a child. A man falling into a puddle and deciding it was the best way to take a bath. It was a silly thought, but it fit the situation. Sometimes the most important actions in life look absurd from the outside. And in that absurdity, there is a kind of purity. Not pretense, not a desire to look better, just simple necessity. The final scene of my life was filled with sounds I hadn't heard before. Quiet voices of memory, the pounding of my heart, and echoes of laughter. I felt the space around me shifting, and I understood that my last seconds shouldn't be wasted on fear. I decided to spend them on gratitude, a small, wordless gratitude to the people who trusted me. Gratitude to those who laughed in the dark, to those who held on to small rituals, and to those who kept children's drawings safe. When I closed my eyes, I saw an image, one small boat desperately cutting through the sea, and many other boats that managed to escape under the cover we created. I imagined one of them reaching a new shore, and children stepping onto land, smiling because no one had told them how hard it had been to survive. That smile was my reward, quiet, like sunrise on a distant planet. My consciousness didn't fade instantly, but gradually, like a pattern dissolving on old fabric. I felt the memory of Earth lingering, like sand in my hand, and I let it go because I realized to give away is also to preserve. By not clinging, we allow things to find light in another place. There was something almost religious in this act, but without dogma. Just the human instinct to keep life going. My last thoughts were simple. Let there be light where we dimmed it a little. Let someone after us sing a song we had forgotten. Let children argue over who told them more funny stories about old Earth. And let them one day look at the stars, not with fear, but with curiosity. This was my farewell not to life, but to the role of a temporary guardian. When my final thought dissolved, I didn't feel loneliness, but rather a belonging to something larger. It was like a warm blanket that covered me for a moment before the night took it away. I understood that any of us can end up as such a guardian, and that knowledge isn't frightening when you realize even one person can change the course for many. That is the essence of responsibility. The story I left behind is not about victory, but about choice. A choice that may seem silly, absurd, or meaningless, but in the end gives a chance. I would like my actions to be remembered not as some dramatic exception, but as a simple human example. When you must choose, choose those beside you. These words don't sound grand, but within them lies the plain truth of what really matters. I wouldn't want people to remember me as a great warrior. Better that they remember me as someone who, in a hard moment, did what was best for others. It sounds modest, but sometimes modesty is the only shield you have, and it actually works. It has no medals, but it leaves a world where children can smile on new soil. Now that my body has become part of foreign dust, I pictured humanity once again gathering its fragments and stirring, like a sleepy animal after winter. Maybe mistakes await them ahead, but they will have a chance. And that chance is not the result of one person, but a chain of people who chose not to run alone. My name in that chain is just one line, nothing more, but I am proud to be it. I can't say death was easy, but it was honest. It gave me time to think and a clear order of actions. I thought about how many things in life feel heavy only because we don't understand their context. Sometimes the hardest act is the simplest at its core, to give what you have for others. That was my philosophy in that moment, and it turned out to be more practical than any tactical reasoning. When it was all over, I felt a strange gratitude for the odd chain of events that allowed me to become who I was in those final hours. Life teaches you unexpected ways to matter, not through grand titles, but through the ability to act. I was grateful to those who trusted me, to those who accepted the risk in my hands, and to those who understood the value of simple things. That feeling carried no pride, only meaning. It may seem like I'm romanticizing the situation, but I'd rather call it honesty. In darkness and fire, we remain ourselves, and sometimes being yourself is enough to let a new day rise over the world. I'd like people to know, courage doesn't demand imitation, it demands understanding. Understanding that sometimes it's better to give than to hold on. And in the end, when I needed nothing but memory, I left one simple piece of advice for those who will read these lines. Value the small things. Keep the jokes and notes about children, the photos and bread recipes. These things aren't trivial, they cement the future. Guard them as I guarded them in those final minutes, as the only proof that our sacrifice wouldn't be wasted. When the ship was finally gone, only a faint glow remained in the endless sea of darkness. That glow was insignificant on a galactic scale, but for us it meant everything. It was the light that allowed someone to take a step onto new ground. And if someday, tomorrow, or many years from now, people gather by a fire and tell stories about those who gave everything for a chance, then maybe my little joke about an orchestra will be among them. And that will be enough for life to go on. I finished this story not with grandeur, but with simplicity. Everything I did for those I loved and to whom I owed a duty. Love and duty are a strange pair. They don't always align, but on the day you must choose, they help you decide. Let that be my legacy, not names or titles, but a choice made without pretense and without shouting, plain and human. As I say goodbye in my thoughts, I ask only one thing. Don't forget that somewhere beyond a viewport, there may be darkness, and someone might be standing there thinking about Earth. Sometimes the best gift you can give another person is to let them continue. And if you ever face such a choice, remember, courage is stepping into the void for others, even if you're afraid.